After World War II, under the Marshall Plan, the United States contributed $13.3 billion in aid to 16 European nations between 1948 and 1951, which averaged about $4.5 billion per year for those 3 years. In today's money, it would be the equivalent to $150 billion. But in the Caribbean island of Cuba, a Soviet Marshall Plan was considerably longer and many times more generous. From 1960 to 1991, Soviet economic and military assistance to Cuba amounted to $75 billion, the equivalent to $500 billion in today's money. During the 80s, Soviet aid to Cuba averaged $4.5 billion, with less than 15% of those funds directed towards military assistance. It's important to clarify this last point, because many will claim that the aid was needed for defense purposes in light of the island's proximity to the United States. But the numbers show that the bulk of the funds went to economic development projects, not weapons. But just think about this for a moment. Unlike Europe in 1948, Cuba wasn't in a state of complete devastation. After World War II, Europe was utterly ruined and its cities destroyed. Towns razed to the ground, roads dotted with shell holes or bomb craters, bridges destroyed or rendered useless, damaged railways, ports littered with sunken ships. The Marshall Plan devoted resources to 16 war-torn countries with a combined population of around 230 million residents. Cuba, which in 1960 had a population smaller than that of Austria, was given the equivalent of 3 Marshall Plans and still ended up as an economic embarrassment. By 1988, more than 400 industrial plants had been built with Soviet money. This does not count billions invested by Eastern Bloc countries such as Poland, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, all of which saw their rubles go to waste. And if you consider the fact that Cuba received beneficial treatment when trading with the socialist bloc, you begin to understand how astonishingly incompetent Cuba's communist regime is. The Soviet Union sold oil to Cuba at below market prices and allowed Cuba to re-export this commodity to the world market. In 1987, the Soviet Union paid Cuba more than 6 times the international market price for imported sugar. The island became such an economic sinkhole that it absorbed 75% of all the aid given by the Soviet Union to all its so-called special friends, a club that included Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, Mongolia, and Afghanistan. To add insult to injury, Cuba never paid the Soviet Union $32 billion in low-interest loans. In December 2013, Russia's government just gave up, took the loss, and forgave 90% of that debt. Such vast sums of money could have been invested in improving the lives of the people in the Soviet Union. Instead, they went down the drains of Havana. In the end, the Cuban communist regime outlived its most generous patron, and after the Soviet Union, other countries would go on to serve as the regime's saviors and enablers. As we will see, those other governments also found themselves in a pickle a few years down the road. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it took Cuba's economy down with it. According to government figures, the GDP dropped by 35%. The authorities declared this time of crisis to be a special period in a time of peace, and implemented a rationing system originally designed as a contingency for wartime. Gas sales to individuals were suspended altogether, and utility services were limited to a few hours a day, with blackouts lasting up to 20 hours a day. In early 1993, nearly half of Havana's 1,200 buses were out of service due to lack of parts, and local taxi services disappeared. Medicine and food shortages threatened the health and nutrition of all sectors of the population. The proud Cuban communist authorities had no choice but to swallow their pride and allow a degree of market freedom. The state revised the constitution to permit new types of private and corporate ownership, establish regulations for foreign investment, convert state-owned companies into profit-driven entities, and legalize the use of the US dollar in circulation. International tourism was embraced. State enterprises renovated existing hotels, collaborated with global partners to construct new ones, and upgraded small airports near coastal destinations to handle seasonal flights from countries like Spain, Germany, and Canada. This debunks another myth which has been widely propagated for years, the myth of the blockade. The fact is, there is no blockade. What exists between Cuba and the United States is an embargo. Non-US citizens can do whatever they want with Cuba. Under the embargo, the US government doesn't allow its companies and individuals to trade or visit Cuba. But even this has a lot of asterisks and exceptions. This was imposed in 1962, after the Cuban authorities confiscated billions of dollars in property from US companies and citizens. Such property ranged from factories to real estate to valuable items. By the way, we should add these to the list of squandered resources. Again, this embargo is limited to U.S. entities. Aside from the United States, companies and citizens from any other country are free to travel to and trade with Cuba, and Cuba is free to do the same with them. That's why in 2022 alone, Cuba imported almost $10 billion from more than 100 countries, including hundreds of millions from the United States. The island exported $1 billion in 2022, mainly to China, Spain, Germany, Portugal, and Switzerland. As you could see, the island imports 10 times what it exports. And that's because the country simply doesn't produce enough goods to do more than this, not because of the embargo. Cuba could export $100 billion worth of stuff and sell it to any country in the world outside of the US. China, India, the European Union, Japan, Russia, anyone. But it can't, because it isn't able to grow or make stuff for global markets beyond that petty $1 billion. As far as tourism is concerned, Meliá, Iberostar, and Barceló are some of the multinational hotel chains that operate in Cuba in association with the Cuban government. When Cuba opened its tourism sector to private investment, the economy started growing again. Yet it created a two-tiered economic system that survives to this day. Those who are connected to the private capitalist economy, meaning the hotels, have access to foreign hard currency and make many times more money than those who are confined to the local Cuban economy. Waiters and taxi drivers make more money in one day than doctors and university professors make in one entire month. Surprisingly, until 2008, even those Cubans who fought for the revolution alongside Fidel Castro were not allowed to enter the hotels and restaurants that were reserved for foreign tourists. Former President Raul Castro, Fidel's brother, lifted the ban in 2008, but that doesn't change the fact that it is nearly impossible for a Cuban to afford such things on a local salary. The growth injected by the tourism industry helped the economy. But the next economic lifeline came when the next one of Cuba's benefactors jumped into the scene. We're talking about Hugo Chavez from Venezuela. Castro had been salivating for Venezuela's oil wealth since he took control of Cuba in 1959. Shortly after his rise to power, Fidel Castro paid his first visit to Venezuela. In private, he asked the elected president Rómulo Betancourt to sell oil to Cuba on special terms, which is code word for below market prices and on credit. He also requested a loan of $300 million. Despite his socialist leanings, Betancourt declined. When Chavez came to power in Venezuela, the moment Castro had been waiting for finally arrived. In the book The Consented Invasion, author Diego Maldonado makes a journalistic account of what he calls a unique phenomenon, one of the most peculiar in the history of Latin America and world geopolitics, the voluntary submission of a rich nation with more than 350,000 square miles and 30 million inhabitants to another one, poorer, 8 times smaller, and 3 times less populated. Starting in the year 2000, Chavez became Cuba's new patron, giving it 53,000 barrels of oil a day. Some of it was destined for Cuba's internal market, while the rest was refined and re-exported to other countries, effectively putting billions in the coffers of the Cuban regime. By the way, the refineries were built with Venezuelan money too. As the years went by, the amount of oil continued to increase, until it reached a peak of 150,000 barrels of oil per day. In spite of not having large reserves of oil under its soil, Cuba's oil exports reached $764 million in 2014. Besides the oil transfers, the Venezuelan government also employed around 220,000 Cubans. This was also a trick to justify sending money to the Cuban state. For example, a Cuban doctor received a salary of barely $300 a month, while the Cuban state was paid $13,000 a month for that same doctor. All of a sudden, Cuban workers were needed for everything: nurses, sports coaches, teachers, agricultural technicians, statistical workers, electricians, engineers, architects, art instructors, you name it. Under that same program, the Castros infiltrated every aspect of the Venezuelan military and security apparatus. It included military advisors, bodyguards, and intelligence agents. As it happened with the Soviet Union, Venezuela's economy also collapsed. Inflation got ridiculous, GDP fell by a shocking 80% in just a decade, and about 8 million Venezuelans have left the country in search for a better life. After Venezuela's economic downfall, the transfers of oil and cash to Cuba saw a sharp decrease. They are still going on to this day, but not remotely to the same extent. Since then, Cuba has entered another period of crisis. Venezuela wasn't alone in propping up Cuba's dictators. Another Latin American country that threw her cash down the drains of Havana was Brazil. In January 2014, the then Brazilian president Dilma Rousseff inaugurated a deepwater seaport in the municipality of Mariel, west of the capital Havana. This was an unusually large foreign investment project for a country like Cuba, at the time approaching $1 billion. It was part of a special economic development zone in the same area. Cuba hoped it could lure foreign investment to it. The inauguration was also attended by Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and Bolivian President Evo Morales. Let me just say that both have had a hard time ever since. Anyways, the works had started under the auspices of the previous Brazilian president, Lula da Silva. It was built by Odebrecht, an infamous Brazilian construction company that was the protagonist of a massive corruption scandal with global implications. When it was finished, the port was promoted by Cuba as the most modern port in the region. Getting reliable data from the Cuban authorities is a very difficult task, but according to their own spokespeople, the project has underperformed. Cubans quietly joke about it, saying that the Mariel zone doesn't take off, it doesn't even walk. Unfortunately, this special economic zone only attracted a little over $3 billion in investments over a decade, a figure well below the $25 billion in foreign investment initially expected. But it gets worse. Over 90% of the so-called investments have come from the state, not from the private sector or foreign investors. Most of the infrastructure operates well below capacity, and out of 64 businesses that supposedly opened operations in this special economic zone, only 44 were operational as of 2023. In terms of maritime traffic, the port is a money furnace, in spite of it not honoring its loans. As early as 2016, the Cuban state stopped paying the loan it took from Brazil to build the port and economic zone. A recurrent behavior of Cuba's government is to not pay back its loans. According to the Argentine newspaper InfoBAE, Argentina has been waiting for 50 years for Cuba to pay a debt that now stands at $15 billion. The pattern has become routine by now. Find a president of a bigger and richer country who feels some kind of nostalgia about the glory of the Cuban Revolution, squeeze his country out of money, resources, and loans until there's nothing left. When the target country gets hit by an economic crisis, move on to the next one and repeat. In 2024, the current lifeline for Cuba's regime is China. But the Chinese have already let the Cubans know that this time, they're not willing to toss their money down the drains of Havana just to stick it to the United States. The Chinese government has been pushing the Cuban government for reforms as a condition for keeping trade and aid flowing. We'll have to wait and see. But now please, let us know in the comments. Why do countries who sponsor the Cuban government tend to find themselves in crisis mode later? How can Cuba succeed economically? This is Latinometry. Subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any of our interesting videos about Latin America and the world. Please like and share this video, and thanks for watching.